when a matte black SUV crept onto the gravel driveway of the weathered farmhouse, its oversized tires crunching like a warning. 82-year-old Agnes June Caldwell stood still at the kitchen window. Her fingers, curled with arthritis, gripped the edge of the floral curtain gently as she squinted through the morning light. At barely 5 feet tall, Agnes had long since stopped needing height to command respect out here in Maple Creek. Vigilance wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. Ever since the hurricane had torn through the region last fall, there had been a new kind of rot settling in, not in the wood or the soil, but in the air. It came in whispers, then in warnings. Men in knockoff uniforms and blacked-out SUVs knocking on old folks' doors, claiming to be from the Homeowners Association. They'd vanish soon after, taking with them heirlooms, medals, and the last of someone's monthly pension. But Agnes didn't live under HOA jurisdiction. She'd made sure of that decades ago. Her home was built by her late husband, Walter, in 1954, when the land was still wild and raw. No board, no dues, no rules, just wood, stone, and the promise of freedom. She had no mailbox inspections or landscaping citations. What she did have was a long memory and a loaded Colt M1911. She stepped back from the window, slow but unwavering, her eyes never leaving the SUV as it rolled to a halt just beyond the porch. The decal slapped on the door read, HOA Enforcement Unit, in crooked letters, already peeling at the corners. It looked as official as a kid's Halloween costume. Her heart didn't beat faster. It didn't have to. Agnes had watched bombs fall over Saigon from a black and white TV. She'd seen her husband leave for Vietnam and return with one less lung. She'd held her grandson's Purple Heart in trembling hands. This wasn't trauma. This was Tuesday. From above the stove, Agnes reached for the high cabinet and pulled down a wooden box, scuffed and dinted with age, but still sealed with the same stubborn latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the Colt. It had belonged to her father, who carried it through the Ardennes, then brought it home in '45. He gave it to her on her wedding day, saying simply, "Only you'll know when." She hadn't fired it in decades, but every other Sunday, she cleaned it the same way he taught her. The rounds were stored in the cellar with her preserved peaches and pickles, kept dry, sealed tight. Today, she didn't need to go to the cellar. The grip of the Colt fit in her palm like it had waited just for this moment. She moved deliberately, the weapon held discreetly at her side, and watched as 3 figures exited the SUV. None of them wore badges. None had name tags. Just smug confidence and mirrored sunglasses. The leader, broad-chested with a buzz cut, stepped forward and yelled, loud enough for the entire quiet street to hear. "We've received a complaint. You're in violation of HOA standards. Cluttered yard, unpaid dues, ordinance breaches." Agnes didn't budge a muscle. Behind the front door, she stood upright, her Colt held low and ready. "You have no right to be here," she called out, her voice calm but iron-wrought. "That's not your decision, ma'am," the man sneered. Then, with a nod to his partner, he kicked the door. The frame shuddered. A second man began circling toward the side window. The third, tall, lean, with a tattooed arm, stood silent but coiled like a snake. They weren't bluffing. They believed they had control. But inside, Agnes stood with the unshakable steadiness of someone who'd lived through chaos before. She didn't need backup. She had backbone. Another kick, harder this time. The latch cracked. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall pine trees. Inside, the grandfather clock in her living room ticked its ancient rhythm. Agnes exhaled slowly. Then the door burst open. The first man entered, heavy boots scraping across the aged hardwood floor. He expected fear. He expected pleading. Instead, he saw Agnes. She stood firm, the hallway dim behind her, the Colt pointed at the floor, but steady. "Don't," she said plainly. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You won't pull that trigger, lady." He took a step forward. The Colt barked once. The sound was deafening in the small house. He crumpled, his leg folding beneath him as he screamed, not just from the wound alone, but from the sheer shock that she'd actually followed through. Outside, the other 2 froze. One fled instantly, crashing backward into a thorny rose bush and dropping his radio with a clatter. The last man yelled in panic, backing hastily toward the SUV. 2 houses down, Retired Sergeant Frank Miller had just finished his morning coffee when he heard the shot. He grabbed his Remington pump action from the hall closet, dialed 911 with one hand, and walked onto his porch. By the time he reached Agnes's front yard, shotgun leveled, the two remaining intruders were scrambling. On the ground, Frank commanded flatly. Now, they obeyed, fear replacing arrogance. Agnes remained just inside her doorway, eyes watchful, the Colt still steady in her hands. But she didn't need to fire again. The cavalry had arrived not necessarily in official uniforms yet, but in community. Frank, the retired sheriff's deputy from across the street. Betty, who was already relaying details to the station dispatcher from her kitchen window. Carl, who'd started filming the suspicious SUV the second he saw it pull up. The official police came minutes later, sirens piercing the morning calm as cruisers swarmed the scene. The three fake enforcers were cuffed and taken away bruised, humiliated, and most of all, stunned. They had picked the wrong house. Within days, investigators uncovered a shocking truth. A Real HOA board member from a nearby, affluent subdivision had been compiling addresses of elderly residents, those without family nearby, those rumored to own valuable heirlooms. He'd sent hired imposters, like the ones Agnes encountered, under the guise of compliance enforcement to intimidate and rob them. The stolen goods had been traced across state lines, but the scam ended abruptly on Agnes Caldwell's porch. At the trial, Agnes entered the courtroom dressed in a simple wool coat and soft gray slacks, her white hair pinned back with quiet dignity. On the evidence table, encased in a clear display box, sat the Colt M1911 worn, historic, symbolic. She took the stand and, in one steady breath, told the jury, "I defended my home. That pistol has protected my family for generations. My father brought it back from Normandy. My husband cleaned it every Sunday. And when that door came crashing in, it was my turn." The courtroom fell silent. No one moved. No one needed to. The jury delivered a unanimous acquittal within minutes. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, but Agnes said little. "I'm old," she stated quietly, her voice clear despite the surrounding noise, "but I'm not weak. And not everyone has a Colt from 1945. Weeks later, two members of the legitimate HOA board were arrested: fraud, conspiracy, accessory to impersonation. The scandal spread far beyond Maple Creek, but something greater happened in its wake. Agnes refused the victim compensation check offered by the city. Instead, she proposed a community safety initiative, free home surveillance systems for seniors, a dedicated hotline for reporting suspicious activity, and monthly wellness checks conducted by trained volunteers, funded by the city council. It passed unanimously. And Agnes? She returned to her porch, her afternoon tea warm, her cane resting at her side, and the Colt now resting in a glass display case beside her rocking chair. A small brass plaque beneath it read, "Carried for country, held for home." Neighborhood children waved as they rode their bikes past her house. "Everything okay today, Mrs. Caldwell?" One called out cheerfully. She smiled, her voice as certain as the sunrise. "Everything's just fine now." And it was. Not because the system had saved her, but because she refused to let it fail her. Sometimes justice comes with sirens and flashing lights. Other times, it comes with a whisper, a steady hand, and a story passed down through generations, etched in steel. And sometimes, all it takes to stop the darkness from spreading is a grandmother with a good memory and a Colt that still works.